Before I begin with my prepared words, if anyone else would like to name people out loud that they've lost to HIV, I would like to name several people who aren't in my life any longer that I miss. David, Pepe, Herman, Andy, and Ron. Would anyone else like to say about them?
Alan, Vince, Stephen, and others who I can't remember.
So according to the Christian liturgical calendar, today is actually New Year's Eve also. So it marks the first day of Advent tomorrow. Actually, it begins at 4 p.m. today by some reckoning. And Advent is a time of anticipation and waiting for the celebration of Jesus' birth in roughly 4 weeks, waiting for the short, cold days of winter to turn into spring again, and waiting for a variety of personal reasons that everybody has in their lives. There's an American theologian, Sister Joan Chittister, who writes that Advent is about learning to wait, not knowing exactly what is coming, only that whatever it is, we will be sanctified. That every bit of what we await, difficult or enjoyable, is a sign of God alive in the world. In short, and in words that sound very Buddhist, we are becoming as we go. And Advent teaches us to stay present, knowing that only a present well lived can possibly lead to the fullness of life. But then today, as we've mentioned, well, tomorrow actually, is World AIDS Day. And according to UN AIDS, by the end of last year, approximately 75 million people had been infected with HIV. That's the virus that causes AIDS. And since the beginning of the pandemic, more than 32 million people have died. Among them, loved ones and dear friends. So what I'm hoping to do today with my words is walk a fine line along this liturgical border of light and dark. Light, Advent is all about candles too. And the present and the future, and what is and what could be. And I want to start with what was. And AIDS has affected the entire world, and the way it has affected different countries is quite different. But I was living in San Francisco at the time, in the Bay Area, and so I'm going to focus on some memories that I have from that time and place. And I'm not doing this to leave out the rest of the world, which experienced HIV and AIDS in a very different way. But this is what I saw firsthand, and it was a time in history that, because of all the deaths, there's not a lot of us around who actually were there and saw it. So I think it's worthwhile to share it with people. So imagine that it's early 1982 in San Francisco. That year's Gay Pride Parade, commemorating the Stonewall riots in New York City that happened 13 years earlier, has just taken place a few days before. After 7 years in an unfulfilling marriage and the birth of one child, I tell my husband that I've fallen in love with a woman and thus figured out that I must be a lesbian. And as you can see from my present incarnation, this was only the first of subsequent understandings and revelations to come. And a lot of course changes in my life. But anyway, at this point, my husband, ex-husband, informs me that several days later that he too has been wrestling for years with a sexual attraction towards men. And 2 months after this, during a friendly pause before our marriage disintegrates into a bitter custody battle, I finagle a press pass for the first ever gay games. This was originally called the Gay Olympics this first year, but then the U.S. Olympic Committee sued the organizers and took out an injunction so we couldn't use the word Olympics. And I remember going through a lot of swag that had been printed with Gay Olympics and having to cross it out with a magic marker and put in games, because otherwise we could have been hit with large amounts of fines and possibly worse, right? But I spent an exhilarating couple of weeks then hobnobbing at events and parties with the likes of queer pioneers. The politician Tom Amiano, you might not recognize these names, but these people were groundbreakers. The poet Teddy Matthews, comedian Robin Tyler, I don't know if you've heard of Robin Tyler, and the organizer of the games, who was a former Olympian himself, Tom Waddell, along with activist Ricky Stryker and Sarah Lewinstein. Sarah was married, actually, to Tom Waddell. They had a child together in this time period. And these were really heady days in San Francisco where anything and everything seemed possible. Rumors had been circulating among a few people about this strange, debilitating illness that was affecting gay men, mostly in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. But most people were not paying that much attention, really. And we had no idea. It was just inconceivable in these celebratory times that probably most of the gay men participating in these parties and these competitions and these events were probably already, at least a large number of them, infected with HIV. And we couldn't imagine that within a matter of months, this pandemic would just take over the entire gay community of the city. And here's where I would like to mention that globally, the pandemic has hit other regions of the world much harder than North America. Sub-Saharan Africa remains the most severely impacted region by far. 2 of every 3 people in Sub-Saharan Africa are currently infected with HIV. In North America, too, it's known as a condition that hits men who have sex with men the hardest, but worldwide this is not true at all. In Sub-Saharan Africa, 13 women are infected for every 10 men who are, and those statistics are even worse among young people. And not only this, but it's worth mentioning, or I think really important to mention, that in the US, it's African American, Latinx, and indigenous communities that have been hit the hardest. In Canada, the infection rates are currently increasing the fastest among indigenous communities. And you'll probably notice a commonality here, which is stigma, racism, and poverty. And it's really frustrating to me because I was studying journalism at the time, and I was getting articles published. And I attended the 6th International AIDS Conference in San Francisco in 1990. And a lot of the researchers there were warning that the epidemic was going to affect people of color severely. It was evident to them that there was this, again, this kind of time bomb that was under the surface, right? But the media just never covered that story, and the agencies that had the money and the researchers, it didn't translate into action. I mean, this is 1990, right? They were warning that people of color were going to be affected severely. And as a result, not enough has been done that could have prevented a lot of unnecessary suffering and deaths. I submitted a story. I don't think it was a story I wrote, but I submitted basically this story to, there's this group that covers they list the 10 most ignored stories of the year, that year, 1990, and it made the list. It just was not being covered, that it was going to hit the community that hard. But going back to the 80s, the first news stories about this illness started, they actually appeared in the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Chronicle in early June of 1981. I heard about it first through word of mouth. It was the gay son of a friend of my ex-husband's. Actually, it was, that's what it was, the gay son of a friend of his. So there were these rumors, right? But again, the media was a little bit slow on the uptake. And even when these articles came out, though, behind the scenes, the caseload was just rapidly going up. By the end of 1981, that year, 337 cases had been reported nationwide, mostly in New York and San Francisco. And within months, 130 of those people had died. That's how fast it was happening. And by the end of the next year, the death toll, the official death toll, was 2,118. And one thing that's really hard for me to wrap my head around to this day is just how staggeringly fast it went from being a rumor to just people dying. I mean, large numbers of people dying, and the whole tenor of the atmosphere in the gay community shifting from celebration and jubilation and kind of this idea that we have the political power now to this, this atmosphere of shock and mourning, and people couldn't wrap their heads around it. I remember walking down Castro Street one day at the height of the pandemic, and normally before that, Castro Street would have just been crowded with beautiful, young, typically boisterous gay men, right? Lecherous gay men. But there was this great energy. And the street was empty except for a couple of men that were tottering together along the sidewalk with canes, bent over canes, just skeletal. They were probably in their 20s or 30s, right? But they looked ancient. And at the height of the AIDS epidemic, it was estimated that 1 in 2 gay men in San Francisco were infected with HIV. I think that's actually worse than sub-Saharan Africa at this point, right? That's 1 in 3. One of my good friends, David, who I mentioned at the beginning, he watched as his entire social network passed away one by one. And he had a very wide social network. He was quite embedded in the community. And then he too sickened and died. And fear made people do terrible things, especially in the beginning of the epidemic. Before the mechanics of the illness were understood, and even for some time afterwards, there were medical personnel who refused to treat people who had HIV. Housemates evicted, tossed out their gay infected roommates. And worst of all, most horrifying of all, was families. Families disowned their dying gay sons. I mean, imagine that. You have your son dying and you just refuse to visit them, acknowledge what's going on. You just essentially disown them. It's hard. I can't even honestly imagine doing that now, but it was happening, and it was happening far too often. But then on the other hand, the love and the heroism displayed by gay men under absolutely harrowing circumstances. It just blew my mind. A diagnosis of AIDS in the 80s and the early 90s basically meant an excruciatingly painful and gruesome death. Yet, in these dark days, even when it was unclear how contagious HIV might be, lovers, ex-lovers, and friends of those with the virus rallied to the bedsides of their infected friends. And they selflessly sheltered and lovingly cared for these people as they died, as the illness took them. And these heroic acts should have dispelled forever the myth that gay men are weak, cowardly, or untrustworthy. And they did for many people. It has been said that the AIDS pandemic actually propelled forward the massive political and civil rights gains that have been made during the past 30 plus years. The thinking behind this is that an AIDS diagnosis forced so many gay men out of the closet when they wouldn't have necessarily revealed their sexual orientation to close friends or family, that it destigmatized being gay, because suddenly everyone knew somebody who was gay in their families or their social network or their friends, right? People couldn't hide it anymore. And soon they didn't want to hide it anymore. There was a militancy. AIDS demolished the myth that being gay was rare or a disorder or a mental illness or a moral failing. In other words, being gay went from something that you were ashamed of and hidden to something that was considered normal and was celebrated. And radical grassroots political movements like ACT UP, they organized to push for more and better medical care and research, which politicized the community generally. And it taught the community a lot of skills of effective organizing and showed us the power of collective action. So while it did set back the community initially, I would say, in terms of political progress, in the end, it had an amazing and transformative and empowering effect, horrible though it was. And such a terrible cost. One of my preteen's daughter's best friends at the time, she watched as her 30-something-year-old father, Pepe, who's a friend of ours, she watched him waste away in the hospital and lost his mind and his ability to control his body. I mean, she was there for that as a teenager, or preteen, actually. Another friend, Herman, when he saw his first Kaposi sarcoma lesion, which that was an opportunistic infection or disease that would happen to people because your immune system would be suppressed. This was before there were any drugs known to treat the disease. And when he saw the first lesion, he broke away abruptly from a conversation with a friend, got into his car, and drove to the Golden Gate Bridge and jumped off. And my ex had to identify his body. The famous also were not spared. You have actors Rock Hudson, Anthony Perkins, French philosopher Michel Foucault, science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, tennis player Arthur Ashe, the poet Teddy Matthews, artist Keith Haring, photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, and transsexual activist and gay man Lou Sullivan, who actually started the support group that I joined, unfortunately, a matter of weeks after he died of HIV. And this would have been in the early 90s, around 91, 92. And Lou was initially refused treatment as a transsexual man, like me, going from female to male, because he expressed a sexual orientation and attraction to men. At the time, even in San Francisco, the thinking was, if you wanted to change your gender, your sex, they had a strict idea of what that meant. And it meant that if you were going from female to male, you were expected to turn out heterosexual and be attracted to females afterwards. And so there were people that refused to treat him, and then when he got infected with HIV, there were doctors who refused to operate on him when he wanted to get top surgery. So he's quoted as saying, and I'm paraphrasing this, that they wouldn't treat me as a gay man, but I'm going to die as a gay man before he died. And the support group that he started, I believe, is still going, and it was an incredible resource for me in my life. It was an incredible group. There were so many groundbreaking people that came through that group that are doing amazing things in the world right now. James Green, who I don't know, you may have heard of, he's written numerous books, and he was the first transsexual person to be elected to the board, the governing board of it's called WPATH, which is the world organization that determines the standards of care for trans people. And up until he served on the board and eventually became the president, there had never been a trans person on this board. It had just all been cis people. So that's only one of many people that came through this group and the friends that we had and stuff. It was really an amazing group. And it was started by Lou Sullivan, who is very well known if you're in my community, his name. Anyway, eventually Tom Waddell died also, the man who started the Gay Games, leaving behind his child, who is an adult now, and Sarah Lewinstein, who he was married to. So medical researchers, though, they were working furiously behind the scenes, and I mean, you have to give them credit. They were working really, like addressing AIDS has broken records, I believe, in the medical establishment in terms of when an unknown illness breaks out and how quickly it was figured out, what caused it, and there were treatments that were developed. It was a process that was far accelerated beyond anything that had happened before. So, and I think that process is still in place, so we all benefit from that. Because that puts in process a new standard of how to deal with unknown illnesses, right? But eventually, they came up initially with a drug called AZT, which seemed to help, but it definitely was not, it didn't stave off the illness completely, and it caused really bad side effects. But then they started putting together various drugs in a cocktail. And another thing that's hard for me to wrap my head around is how quickly, this would have been in the early, mid-90s, right? How quickly AIDS or HIV went from being a gruesome death sentence to suddenly being manageable. And even David, my friend, if he had probably held on to just, I think just a matter of weeks longer, he might still be alive now, because that's how quickly it went from this death sentence to being manageable and potentially having a long life. Not that these drugs don't have side effects and can really affect your quality of life, and also they're expensive, and I mean, you know, they're not, AIDS is still not something to be taken lightly, right? But, and now it's like, it's regarded by many gay men, it seems, younger gay men who weren't even alive at this time period. It seems that it's not really considered that big of a deal, which I think anyone who lived, any at least person who lived through this era with a connection to the gay community, I don't think we can ever really take it casually like that. I know I can't. Somehow it would seem almost disrespectful to the friends that I lost and the loved ones that I lost. I've already mentioned their names. And so I think I'd like to try to end on a little bit more than a note of just mentioning how, while it was such a terrible, terrible time, like Marcus said, there's always another side to it. You know, it did propel forward the gay community to where we now have same-sex marriage, and most people, when they come out, there still are families that reject them, unfortunately, but so much has changed, right? And this medical process has been set in place that will benefit people going forward. I mean, light and darkness, right? But on that note, during this time too of Advent, Anglicans, which I'm now part of, we like to ponder the question of what are we spending our precious time in our lives for? What star are we following, right, from the Christmas story? And in the same way that treating AIDS lightly would seem like disrespect to my dead friends, I think also failing to live my long life, my blessed life, with purpose and meaning would also be in some way failing to honor them. And so I'm going to end with one of the Bible passages that Anglicans traditionally read this weekend. It's an excerpt from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 13. And whatever other commandments there may be are summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And do this understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. And to that I say amen.